last week we began looking at the Old Testament scriptures that speak about marriage and family. I pray that you've had the opportunity to read through those scriptures and focus on the ladies and especially the biblical principles that we see about our role as wives and as mothers. Aren't we grateful that God did create us as women and He gave us very unique roles and functions in the home? Well, this week we're going to be focusing on the Old Testament teachings about women, especially in leadership. Now, this will be an interesting discussion and lots of important scriptures to read, both in the Old Testament and then later in a couple of weeks we'll look at some New Testament teachings about women in leadership. But as we focus on women in leadership in the Old Testament, it's going to be so easy for us to highlight several very outstanding women who in the Old Testament time served in very significant roles of leadership. One of the things that we see is as God not only created us in His image with equal worth and value, but as women He gave us distinctive roles and functions, that we also see how God gifted each one of us according to His grace. According to His grace, He gave each one of us spiritual gifts. And then He challenges us as we grow in Him, as we learn more about Him, to use those spiritual gifts in ministry to others. And so many women in the Old Testament are great examples to us of women who used their spiritual gifts in leadership. So this week we're going to be looking at Miriam. Now Miriam is a lady we meet early in the Old Testament because of her role in the life of Moses. But later in her life we see her as a woman in leadership, and especially as she is described as a prophetess. So we'll have the opportunity not only to see how Miriam followed the Lord in leadership, but especially this role of prophetess and how that function actually takes place within a body of believers. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion for you as we understand better who Miriam was and how God gifted her for leadership. Secondly, we'll be looking at the Old Testament character of Deborah. I've always loved the story of Deborah and identified in many ways with the life of Deborah. But you know, Deborah was called in the Old Testament not only a prophetess but a judge. And we'll learn from Deborah how she used her spiritual gifts for leadership. And again, we'll learn some important biblical principles that will help you and me as we follow the Lord and serve the Lord in our own lives and ministries. So we'll be looking specifically at that function of judge and how Deborah was a judge of the Lord in such godly ways. There's another judge in the Old Testament we mentioned briefly, mainly because it's important, I think, for us to know those lesser characters in the Bible, or those characters in the Bible that we know less about. This judge's name was Huldah. And so we'll take a few moments this week to read the scripture about Huldah, to learn more about her and how she was a wise judge, a woman who served as a wise judge during the Old Testament period. And finally, Esther. Esther was a wonderful leader in Old Testament time for such a time as this. You may have often said that, as I have. When God raises up someone to stand in the gap and to serve and to lead at an important time, we often think of the woman Esther, who did that in her own country of Persia in Old Testament times. So we'll look at several of the key passages in the book of Esther, and again ask the Lord to teach us some guiding biblical principles about leadership. It's my prayer as you are reminded of these women in leadership in the Old Testament that you'll use them to begin helping you to understand as we move through the class, and especially as we begin to apply these biblical principles to our role as women in the church, that we'll better understand not just what can we do as women in the church, but what should we do according to God's perfect plan. I'll be praying for you this week as you get to learn even more about these awesome women who were leaders in the Old Testament.